Welcome to the Freedive Café, episode 15, with Aharon Solomons. My name is Donnie, host of the Freedive Café. The Freedive Café is long-form interviews that get into the backstories, the training, the challenges, the passions and fears and personal philosophies of the merry band of breath holders known as Freedivers. The Freedive Café lives mainly at freedivecafé.com. All the episodes, show notes and the new blog can be found there. Make sure you visit the Facebook page too, guys. Go to facebook.com/Freedive Café podcast and you'll find it there. Hit the like button and share it with your friends. Merry Christmas to one and all and happy birthday to me. Haha. I've got a lot of news today, so here we go. First of all, I'd like to announce that this episode of the Freedive Café is brought to you by Audible. Man, I'm so stoked and proud to get Audible as a sponsor for the show. Back when I was starting this thing, I knew that eventually I would like to have sponsors, but I said I would only have freediving related sponsors and possibly Audible. And here we are, we got Audible. For those of you who don't know, Audible is the biggest and best provider of audiobooks in the known universe. They have more than 180,000 titles to choose from, and you can listen on your iPhone, your Android phone, your Kindle, through the free app. So you're already loving podcasts, you're probably gonna be into audiobooks too, and Audible has an amazing offer to share with listeners of the Freedive Café. If you go to audibletrial.com/freedivecafe, you will be able to sign up for a free 30-day trial and you'll get one audiobook for free. Anything you want. It doesn't cost you a penny and Audible will throw a few bucks my way, so do us both a favor and go and sign up for the trial. You know, I always ask my guests to recommend a book or an author, so many of those books are available to download from Audible. For example, Dan Verhoeven, episode 2, he recommended Fluke or I Know Why the Winged Whale Sings by Christopher Moore. You could go to audibletrial.com/freedivecafe and sign up, and you could be listening to that book within minutes. Another one I'd like to recommend, and an absolute essential if you're obsessed with freediving, is One Breath, Freediving, Death, and the Quest to Shatter Human Limits by Adam Skolnick. That's an amazing book that charts the journey and the tragic death of Nick Mavoli. It's a really sad story, but it's also chock full of freediving knowledge and insights from some of the top athletes in the world. So if you want to gift yourself and the Freedive Café a little Christmas present this year, go to audibletrial.com/freedivecafe and take it from there. Okay, let me tell you about the Patreon situation. We now have 34 patrons, which is almost the same as 35. So as far as I'm concerned, the first goal has been met. And starting from January, I will now be releasing 3 episodes per month. Come hell or high water. Guys, thank you to everyone who has made this possible. We're all happy campers now. We get more cafe action, even if it means a lot more work for me. And it's thanks to donations from patrons. There have been some changes to the Patreon goals and rewards. Check out the Patreon page to see what I mean. And I've sent all current patrons a message to explain. But most importantly, what's happening is I'm going to start adding a little Q&A section to the regular episodes. And if you're a patron who pledges $5 or more a month, it will be your questions I ask first. If you're one of those patrons, check your inbox. I've sent you the schedule of the next 3 guests I'll be interviewing, and you can send me your questions and I will do my damnedest to ask them for you, unless they're completely stupid questions, of course. If you want to support the show with a few dollars a month, head over to patreon.com/freedivecafe and take it from there. By the way, if you want to support the show but don't want to become a patron or get a free audiobook for some reason, you can also send a one-time donation through PayPal or even send Bitcoin. Go to the website freedivecafé.com for details. So some of you may have noticed that the written blog is now officially live on the website. I've posted a little article about my backstory and the inception of the Freedive Café there to get the ball rolling. I'm going to be posting regularly with details about my own training and experiences and thoughts. For example, in March and April, I'm going to be doing my instructor course, so I'm going to be walking you guys through that as I go. I'm also going to have some written interviews there and maybe product reviews eventually. But what I really, really want is your contribution. I don't want the blog to be just about me. I want you guys, you inspired, breath-holding beauties, to write your own stories and send them to me. And I will share them on the blog. If you have anything you want to share, get in touch with me and we'll take it from there. You can write anything you want, and as long as it's about freediving in some way, shape or form, I'll consider it. Alright, let's get down to business. It's my birthday today, and I could not imagine a better birthday present than hosting my very own freediving podcast. Just the idea of it was not even embryonic a year ago. The podcast has just hit 15,000 downloads, which completely blows my mind. And to have such a very special guest on this special day, I am feeling blessed indeed. This episode is the first of 2 parts, which will be a Christmas and New Year special. And as you'll see, it's a little different from the other episodes in format. Here's the story. About 2 months ago, I sat down with Aharon Solomons for an interview. Little did I expect that 4 hours later we would still be sitting there. It wasn't so much an interview as a seminar of epic proportions delivered by Aharon, who was in fine form, wherein he elucidates some of the most interesting ideas in freediving training and culture. Throughout the course of those 4 hours, we dipped into and out of topics. We veered wildly into non-freediving territory sometimes and got lost in the woods a few times. But in the end, we pulled it all together, and I was left with this huge amount of amazing knowledge and wisdom to share with you guys. The problem was, it was all over the place, literally. So what I have done to present this information in the most useful way, I hope, is edit down Aharon's audio into sections, and I've post-recorded some introductions to the sections. A few weeks after talking with Aharon through Skype, he turned up in Taiwan, and I got to meet him in person. By pure coincidence, it turns out Aharon's son lives here in Taiwan, very close to me, and Aharon got in touch and suggested we meet up for a coffee. We had a great chat, I learned even more, and I couldn't help but feel impressed by his kindness, patience, and a fucking brilliant sense of humor. Excuse my language. Is this a family podcast? I'm not sure yet. Anyway, things you will hear about today: falling in love with a shark, training with Pipin Ferreras and Umberto Pelizzari, learning packing from Bob Croft, the story of Hagi, flooding techniques, Frenzel, the difference between a cheek fill and a mouth fill, everything about RV training, trigger points, psychological barriers, blood shift, lung squeeze, beta-fe, blackouts, LMC, water temperature and mammalian dive reflex, nitric oxide and free radicals, yoga, meditation, yoga nidra, sleep training and programming the subconscious, hibernation, decompression sickness, nutrition, allergies, style, high altitude training, and why cats are better than dogs. Well, actually, I think I left that part out. I'm not sure. Anyway, strap your propeller hat on and get ready to blast into the brain of Aharon Solomons. Merry Christmas, and let's dive. So to get started, Aharon tells us the story of how he came to discover and become fascinated by the underwater world.
I was 12 years old. I was in Madeira, the holiday with my parents, and again by myself. I spent an awful lot of time by myself as a kid, and they had just given me some flippers, as they were then called, and a mask and a snorkel. It was one of those round masks. It looked like the bottom of a small barrel, and a snorkel. And right off the hotel, there was a cliff, and then there was a lift that took you down the cliff to a little platform at the bottom, a natural rock platform where they had a bar and an entry into the water at water level. So I went down there and I noticed there was a raft offshore, about 100 meters away, and I paddled my way out to the raft, looking down, and was just amazed. Clear blue. It looked like there was no sea. It was like the sky. And these beautiful, sparkling little jewels of fish that I couldn't name them at all. There's tropical fish with brilliant colors suspended in this pure blue. And I was flabbergasted. So I was caught then. So I went out, lay on the raft there, and stuck my head in the water so I could do that much longer, and held my breath and looked at these fish and looked at the whole world, because the bottom of the raft had things growing on it, and there was a whole life going on underneath, a whole history going on there. And I was fascinated. Anyway, one day, something really weird happened. A man, dressed in a very peculiar fashion, with 2 steel cylinders on his back, and 2 very large diameter hoses going from his back, from a round drum on his back to his mouth, and was breathing underwater. I noticed he had weights around his waist, and he had a pair of flippers on, as we called them there. And I think it was the second or third day, he actually surfaced at the raft, because he must have seen my feet there. He came up and he spoke to me. And he spoke to me in French. He was French. And I had been brought up with French as well. So he was delighted. In Madeira in those days, late 40s, early 50s, he was delighted to find another tourist who spoke French. So he explained to me all about what he was doing, and I was fascinated with it. And then about the 3rd or 4th time this happened, we would meet regularly there. About the 3rd or 4th time this happened, he said to me, "Would you like to try this?" And I said, "Wow, could I?" So I had my first lesson in scuba, and my first lesson in scuba was one sentence: don't hold your breath. If you run out of air, he didn't bother to tell me about the lever on the side of the tank. They had levers, reserve levers in those days. He didn't bother to tell me about that. He just said, don't hold your breath. If the tank starts getting difficult to breathe, go up and breathe out all the way. So I took this very seriously, because he said it with a very stern expression on his face. And he said, I'll be swimming above you. Don't swim down deep. Keep close to me. So I did, and we swam around for a bit. I don't know how long or how far or anything else, but I was in a world. I was in paradise. Yeah, I loved it. And at the end of the holiday, I couldn't leave my parents alone until they provided me with being the opportunity to do that in the Scilly Islands in England, which are absolutely stunningly beautiful to this day and very interesting. And that was my first thing on scuba.
Now we shoot ahead in time for a little more backstory. Aharon is going to tell us about living in Israel and how his first foray into freediving was a result of having to supplement his 1 chicken ration by spearfishing in the Mediterranean.
Later in the forces, which we shan't mention, I was introduced to things like oxygen rebreathers, which they had in those days, and all sorts of other shit. And then a more professional education in the line of breathing underwater took place. And then in Israel, we're going to have a jump, because there was a jump in time, because there was a gap where I wasn't really in contact with it. And then in Israel, what happened was, in the very early days there, I was on what was called a Moshev Shitufi, which was it was like a kibbutz, but you lived in your family group. And they provided you food, but you ate at home, not like the kibbutz where you ate in a communal settlement. And in those days, you had 1 chicken per family per week, and that was your protein ration. And we were working something like 18 hours a day in the fields doing very heavy physical work. I had 2 small boys by this time. So anyway, I then took over providing food for the family, more protein. So after work, I had a spear gun that I'd made up out of inner tube tires, a bit of wood, a spear that had been confected in the workshop, and a trigger mechanism that I'd contrived. And anyway, I ventured forth with, again, a round mask and flippers and a snorkel. And during the summer, it was great. I brought in a lot of fish, and the family ate better than anybody on the settlement. And I did give out fish to the neighbors and became momentarily quite popular. We were probably diving the noble depths of about 6 meters, if truth were known, and not much more than that. Pretty shallow in the Mediterranean there. In winter, I still needed to eat. We couldn't have dreamed of affording a suit in those days, and there weren't that many around, commercially available, and they were pretty hard to get hold of. Probably in France you could, or Italy, or maybe Greece, but certainly not where we were. So we invented all sorts of things with sweaters and duct tape, and that was my first bit of freediving.
Working as a scuba instructor in Eilat, Aharon starts to get seriously fed up with the whole thing. He's going to tell us why, and then we'll hear about falling in love with a shark.
Years later, when I come back to Israel and from abroad, and I was working again as a scuba instructor in Eilat, and I've been reading about freediving passionately. And it was about the time I was getting really seriously fed up with scuba. I'd had it with it. The people had changed who came into it. People no longer came into it. They were athletes and adventurers. People came in because they wanted to get the card to show around at parties or whatever. Fathers came in with sons. The sons were always embarrassingly better than the fathers. You got boys coming with their girlfriends who were being dragged there and trying to pretend they weren't being dragged there, and desperately wanted you to throw them out. And anyway, it wasn't my cup of tea anymore. The gear had got far better. Cousteau had already said that it was a sport for athletic grandmothers, and I had lost interest in it. So I was down in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh, where I joined a German group who were feeding sharks underwater. The first people to really feed them from the hand without cages. And they were studying from the University of München the shutter movements of the eye of the shark while feeding. So anyway, I joined these other 2 clowns, and we had a marvelous time on the beach in Ras and feeding sharks, and that's where I made the acquaintance of a very beautiful shark called Shmulik, who got his portrait tattooed on my shoulder because I fell in love with him. He was easily recognizable because he had a big hook in the corner of his mouth.
What kind of shark was he?
He was a black-tip reef shark. Not huge, but he was decent size, but he was the only shark I've ever met in my life who was clumsy. He would fall over his own feet, so to speak, and he never got any of the fish that we were feeding. And I felt desperately sorry for him. We had a lot of adventures with Shmulik. He became like a dog who would follow us the moment we got into the water till the moment we came out. I had a girlfriend who was absolutely crazy at that time, who was a tall blonde girl. She was a model and an actress and had a temperament. And one day she was out swimming, and Shmulik was following along underneath her. She'd made friends with Shmulik by that time. And an army outpost on the top of the hill started shouting at her to get out, get out, get out. She didn't understand because they were shouting in Hebrew. And then they started shooting into the water around her because it was swimming along underneath. Well, then she got the message. She got out of the water, marched up the hill, and there was a little, fence and posters, guard thing. Pushed past the guard, as she was in a bikini bottom only. She was tall and imposing, walked up to the first soldier, she said, and said in English, "Who is your commander?" And they pointed some poor miserable individual out to her, and she walked up and slapped him right across the face and explained that if you ever attack Shmulik again, I will cut the balls off you. She wasn't very diplomatic. But Shmulik was a great love. And just before we left Ras Mohammed, there's still a partner of mine living in Dahab called Ingo Ripper, who photographed most of this stuff. We took out the hook without turning him over on the back to make him catatonic, which we know all about. It wasn't necessary. He opened his mouth for us, and we cut the hook at the bend and pulled one way and then the other way and got the hook out. And Shmulik went off. This was days before the Egyptian takeover, maybe 2 or 3 days.
Aharon now meets 2 very special characters. We'll hear who that is and where that eventually led him.
One day, 2 individuals walked into the club where I was, tall individuals, and I recognized them immediately from French magazines that I'd been reading called Apnea, in which a good friend of mine today was writing a lot about freedive training, a brilliant trainer called Claude Chapuis, who is a trainer and has been of all the French elite and all the French team. He lives in Nice. He's a prof from the Faculté des Lettres there. He's an ski instructor, for which we'll try to forgive him. And anyway, I'd recognized them, and I went along and started asking them a lot of questions. And they were very nice and very patient with me, and then invited me. They explained that they were going down to shoot a movie in the extreme south, in Durham. So they invited me to train with them that day in the water, if I was interested in it practically and not just talking about it, and I did.
And these 2 individuals, who were they?
Yes, Umberto Pelizzari and Francisco Ferreras, Pipin.
Right. So, no one really. Yeah,
right. Anyway, right at the end of the stint in the south, they came back up to Eilat, and we had a dinner in a famous restaurant in Eilat called the Miflat Aharon, which is the last refuge. At the end of the dinner, it had some funny atmosphere. They weren't getting on all that well, but Pipin said to me, "Would you like to come and train in Cuba?" And I said, "Well, of course. I can't think of anything I love better." And I didn't think anything of it. But again, cutting the story short, I got a letter and I got visas and tickets and what have you, and ended up in Cuba being with Pipin. And which was my first intense period of scuba diving. Yeah, my first freediving thing.
So, after training with Pipin, Aharon heads back to Eilat and starts teaching freediving for the first time.
From then on, I could think nothing except freediving and started actually teaching what I know or sharing what I knew in Eilat, and determined to establish the first records. Don't forget this was bifins, and I thought, well, how do I do this? Because if I do an unassailable record, it's not going to promote freediving.
Could you just give us a little bit of an idea about how different the freediving world was at the time, in regards to what we knew about it?
Scuba backup for no limits does. And in those days, the theory was that you had what was called the daisy chain. That if you blacked out deep or had a problem deep, there were divers stationed at different depths on different mixtures that would bring you up to the next diver, and then he would pass you to the next diver and brought you up to the surface. Nobody had ever really tried this out. I don't know of anybody who really ever tried that out from serious depth, and I can't imagine them doing it. Because it's very difficult to ensure the integrity of the airway on the way up. But that's what, at least psychologically, passed for safety in those days. So, anyway, I came back and I did a constant weight record in bifins, just to put something on the slate so people could attack that, hopefully. And that was a 40-meter dive in bifins. That was my first recorded dive. We left Israel. We were working I met Maria Teresa in Crete. She fell in love with freediving.
You started teaching freediving already when you were back in Eilat. Was there any kind of organization like AIDA or CMAS, anything established at the time that had some kind of educational material that you could teach to people?
No, AIDA came along later. Yeah. What happened was that if you know the history of how AIDA was formed, Claude was teaching freediving to a club called Inspiration in Nice, a private club that was also named the Deep Blue and all the rest. It was after the film The Big Blue. I think his club was also called The Big Blue after that, but the real name was L'Inspiration, where a lot of the elite began. And one of the people who was in the club was a guy called Cyril Izoardi. He'd been with Pipin and I in Cuba. He came back. Pipin was pretty much exclusively a no-limits diver by this time. He said, quite rightly, the man in the street the two questions he's going to ask you, how deep have you been and how long can you hold your breath? And he doesn't give a damn how you did it. All he's interested in are those two facts. And so anything else, he said, is a pure waste of time, which I don't agree with him about, but I mean, he had a certain point there from a commercial point of view. Anyway, Cyril came back to Nice and he was diving up to 5 times a day to depths of 125 meters. And on the 5th dive one day, he didn't return to the surface. The only safety he had was his brother, who couldn't swim, who was in a boat and who had built the sled and helped him organize the sled and the weights and what have you. And
what do you think happened to him?
Probably decompression sickness. Yeah, I think it's the most likely explanation. I mean, 4 times a day to depths of over 125 meters, it's asking for it. There was another guy who managed to get himself paralyzed, an Austrian, who was diving 120 meters 4 times in the morning and then doing 100 meters with long holes at the bottom 4 times in the afternoon. Another Pipin student, and he ended up paralyzed as well.
So now we get into the early days of freediving physiology. We're going to hear about the legendary and pioneering Bob Croft and his experiments with scientist Carl Schaefer.
The physiology of freediving, don't forget, in the 60s, the early 60s, Enzo Mallorca, who was trying to get, this is in the late 50s, he was trying to get to the colossal depth of 50 meters. And he was warned by the physiologists, don't do it, it's impossible. We made a model of the human thorax, we put it into a recompression chamber, pulled the pressure up to 6 atmospheres, which is 50 meters, and the thing imploded. Only certain death is waiting for you at 50 meters. Enzo did not know physiology all that well, but he knew Italian very well, and he said something to the effect of vaffanculo. And then he went a lot deeper, ending his career with a dive to 105 meters. If you've seen The Big Blue, there was another person who was vying for all the records at that time, somebody who's become a great friend of mine called Bob Croft, an American, who was sponsored by the US Navy. And he had a person accompanying him, a physicist, as a physiologist, called Dr. Carl Schaefer. And one day Carl said to Bob, I think I know why Enzo's lungs did not collapse. I think the blood from the legs and the arms migrates to the core and the noble organs and protects it.
So he's describing blood shift for the first time.
He put Bob in a big pot of water, right? And Bob had wrist cuffs and ankle cuffs round with electrodes attached to them. And what's it called, an ohm meter or something, that measures resistance of a passage of electricity. And if the blood, which has got a high degree of salinity, leaves the arms and the legs, the resistance would go up, because saline solution is a better conductor of electricity than being without it. And there was better conductivity. He managed to prove that the blood did leave the arms and the legs in a pot in the recompression chamber. So Carl really was the first person, I think, to demonstrate blood shift. So he managed to demonstrate that long before Doppler testing and all the rest of it. Carl had been in another navy before the U.S. Navy. He'd been in the Unterseekraft, in the U-boats. And he was quite an expert in these things. Carl's an interesting man. He really is. I don't think he's any longer with us. Bob certainly is. Bob's alive and well. Bob is actually 5 years older than I am. It's hard to believe, but there are people like that. Anyway, I love Bob like crazy. He taught me packing in his living room in upstate New York. And he'd never succeeded in teaching it to anybody before, and I started putting it all around the freediving world. Later on, when I was going back from Bob's, the visit to Bob in upstate New York, I stopped in at Nice, had a very nice meal with Claude, and Claude said, "Oh, Aharon, what have you been doing?" And I said, "Well, I've been to visit Bob Croft. You know who this is?" And he said, "Of course I know Bob. I know of Bob. I have never met him, but I know Bob." Anyway, he said, "So what did Bob have to say?" I said, "Well, he showed me this new technique, and I demonstrated it. And I have movies of on tape of Jacques Mayol, Bob sitting on the platform, because there was a platform at water level on those days in which he ventilated before doing his dive, and he was packing before he went down. And Mayol became convinced that this was Bob's great secret of the depths, because until Mayol invented the lift bag, actually what they were doing was variable weights. They were coming up under their own steam, and nobody could beat Bob. I mean, eventually he did 73 meters, which is a colossal depth in those days. Anyway, so I talked about this to Claude, who said, "Oh, very interesting." About a year later, or 2 years later, I was in Ibiza, and a member of the French team said, "Oh, Aharon, we have a new technique." In those days, people shared information, not like they do nowadays, where they hide it like squirrels hiding nuts. And he said, "We have this new technique called la carpe." And I said, "Why la carpe?" He said, "It's like the mouth of a carp, and you do this." And he said, "Do you know this?" And I said, I think I've heard of it somewhere before. But the French had invented it by then.
So the next voice you'll hear is Alina, Aharon's partner, and she's going to explain how Bob Croft discovered packing.
I can tell you that Bob invented packing because as a kid, he, probably because of lack of vitamins, had rickets, which doesn't allow the sternum to properly close, and then you can't relax and sleep.
If you're on your back. Yeah.
If you're on the back. And as a kid, he was lying on the back and would in order to inflate his belly as much as he can, and then when he exhaled,
he could relax.
He could relax
and fall asleep. Relief from that.
Yep.
Yeah.
And later on in the Navy SEALs, or their predecessor, he thought, that might help me.
So that's where Bob started, really. He was the father of packing in freediving.
We'll now hear a little bit about the controversial character of Pipin Ferreras. We'll dig deep into the technique of flooding and hear the fantastic story of Hagi and his rescue of the anchor.
Very few people know these things. I mean, Pipin, for all the things that, he became very unpopular after Audrey's death. And a lot of people started bad-mouthing him in the most hideous fashion. Pipin is a dark character. He's not an easy character, but he's always been wonderful with me and superbly generous with me. I've stayed in his house several times. He just requires, he's an individual with his own particular thing. But he is the father of flooding.
Could you just explain how flooding works, and is that something that you've experimented with yourself?
Yes. What happened was that before I left Cuba, Jacques Mayol's book came out, Homo Delphinus, and it was the French version. Both Pipin and I read French. I say that because Pipin had a French wife at one time, and I'm not sure whether the story that we read is in the English version. That's why I'm mentioning the languages. It was the story of Georgios Hagistati, the Greek sponge diver, who in 1913, pay attention to this, there was a Italian battle cruiser called the Regina Margherita. And it docked, it came into the bay of Karpathos in Greece. And the bay there is got a depth of 30 meters. It's like a plate. And at the entrance to the bay, there's a slope that falls off to about 200 meters. The battleship came in, dropped anchor. Don't forget, this is in the days before sonar and all that kind of stuff. So you found out the depth when you approached the shore by swinging the lead, if you know what I mean. A lead weight on the end of a knotted string that told you what depth you were at. And they dropped the anchor in what they thought was 30 meters. They pulled backwards to set the anchor, and the anchor went off the slope because they were too far out. The anchor, the whole chain, rattled out and whipped, killing one man. I think he cut one man in half and he beheaded another one, sailor. It was a gory accident, and the captain didn't know what to do next. I mean, you're a coal burner, you're a long way from Italy, and hey, mate, you can't dock, there's a storm coming up, and what are you going to do without an anchor? Because ships did not carry, several ton anchors, a lot of them. So the captain was stressed, and he said to the ship's doctor, well, we've only got one choice, and that's investigate what the island can come up with. He was hoping for a diver with a Seep Gorman hat, hard hat, little van with a compressor on it and all the rest of it that would pull up and help. Well, the doctor, who had formed a man of great intellectual curiosity and had formed an attachment with the mayor of Karpathos, laid the thing before the mayor and said, look, we've really got a problem. And the mayor said, don't worry, we'll sort you out. I'll send you a man tomorrow morning. So, anyway, what happened was that little old Greek, about 40 years old, scrawny guy with a grey moustache, turned up the next morning with a long rope wrapped around his shoulder and chest, and under his arm was a stone, a marble, attached to the rope. And the doctor laughed and said, what the hell is this? And Hagi said, look, he said, what's your problem? And the doctor explained that the anchor had gone off into an unknown depth that could be anywhere down the slope, and probably very deep. And the point was, A, finding it in the dark, and B, getting it, retrieving it. And they had some kind of a fix on where it dropped. So he said, don't worry, I'll get it for you. So he didn't believe a word of this. But he was curious. and he did a medical examination of the man, which is under Italian naval medical records. It's recorded. Hagi had no eardrum in one ear and a torn one in the other ear. Because when you are holding the scandolepetra, the stone, with both hands, and you're going head down, you can't take one hand away to equalize. So what it turns out, and this took me a long time to find out, that the actual technique of the Greek sponge divers was when they were young, they burst the eardrums.
Right, deliberately burst the eardrums just to take away the problem from the beginning.
After your cousin had died and you'd been a little boy, you know, cutting up fish on the boat or something, and now it was your turn to grow up and be a diver, and they would send you down with a stone, and you'd come up crying with blood pouring out of your ear and everything else, and they'd say, congratulations, you're a diver now. It was a rough life in the islands. That was Kalimnos and Simi. Actually, Hagi was from Simi. Doesn't matter. And this story absolutely fascinated us. What happened was that Hagi and his brother did dives between 100 meters. This is 1913. 100 meters and 77 meters. Where dig this, they went down with a shackle that must have weighed close to 2 kilos. The pin, let alone the full shackle itself. They found the anchor chain. On breath hold down there, they attached the shackle to it, and then it was a rope was fed round it, and eventually the whole thing was pulled to the surface. Now, if you can imagine holding your breath, the stone you have to tuck under your arm and walk around on the bottom, because, hey, that's your only way back. You stood on the stone and were pulled up to the surface by the carroceres, the guys who were pulling you up to the surface. And you, all the time, you don't want your come-home rope, the rope you went down with, attached to the stone, you don't want that to get tangled in the rope that's going to pull up the anchor, do you? And you have to do all that in the dark, and don't forget the thermoclines in Greece. You can have 24 degrees on the surface, and at 17 or 27 meters, you can be down to 17 degrees. At 50 meters, you're closer to 13 to 15 degrees. And these guys were stark naked. There were no suits, nothing in those days. All the divers were males. They didn't worry about modesty. And it was just your skin, the stone, no nose clip, nothing. You went. And this led me into, this had a huge impact on me, this story. First of all, it told me all I needed to know about scientists and freediving. In 1953, nearly 50 years later, or 40 years later, they were still disputing that the human being could pass the incredible barrier of 50 meters.
The story is, it's fascinating, but it's also, it has the sounds a bit fantastical as well. Besides the medical record, what else makes you believe that this was a true story?
Photographic record. There are very good pictures of the whole thing, of Hagi's boat, the retrieval of the anchor, everything else. It was very well documented. All the Italian naval documentary, unless you believe they're all liars. It's a terribly well documented story. And Umberto has reproduced the dive. Yeah. We have too. So, I mean, come on, guys. This happened.
Okay. Okay, I'm with you.
And it also had a huge psychological effect on me that has persisted to this day. I have no patience whatsoever, and now I'm training a lot of elite divers, for the spoiled diver. Those who have to do 2 hours meditation for a 70 or 80 meter dive, and they have to have a blue-green smoothie in the morning, and everything has to be absolutely perfect on the surface with everybody going, shh, yeah, and it's done in flat, calm water with a noodle behind the head and another noodle under the knees and all the rest of it. Sorry, not for me. I don't train my divers that way. If somebody wants to set 6 alarms on the way down to cue him in, he doesn't train with me. No watches, and very often no marks on the rope. You dive according to sensations. You learn the sea and you learn yourself. You learn to take cues from the water, the thermoclines, how the light changes, how everything else, till it becomes utterly automatic to you. And when that happens, you don't have to rely, and you're not waiting for intention for an alarm. And is it ever going to come? Oh, yes, there, it's there. And all the rest of the stuff. Or it's not there because I forgot to set it. No, sorry, that, if you want to do that, go and train with somebody else, not with me. And so it's had a very profound effect, that story. And when I went to Kalymnos, and when I heard the old people talking about their relatives who had dived there, it wasn't unique, that story. I realized that there was a whole culture of this. Later on, the guy who did, the first guy to pass 200 meters on a single breath, who you know about, Patrick Moussima, who also flooded. Yeah, because each of us, Pipin included, learned how to flood, but we each learned in different ways and taught ourselves in different ways. And Patrick became a very adept proponent of this. First of all, you've got a certain amount of air pressure both in your sinuses and in your eustachian tubes and in the whole system. And until that air has been compressed, in other words, until you've got down to approximately between 80 or 90 meters, you can't flood. Or if you could, it would be with a very aggressive movement that would be dangerous. If you are going down feet first or knees first on a sled, all you have to do is when you reach those depths, you don't have a nose clip on, you don't have a mask on, and you control the entry of the water digitally with your forefinger and thumb, bit by bit, until the sinuses and middle ear fill up. It's not unpleasant. The first time it might sting a bit, but after the first time, you don't even feel it. It's not unpleasant because it's got the same salinity as your blood, as your body. And once you're flooded, you can drop like a stone at whatever speed you like, because there's no longer, you've got water in and water out, and there's no longer any need to equalize. And it is, for no limits and for variable weight, the technique of the future. There's no question of it. All this bloody business with a bloody Coca-Cola bottle with no bottom to it, not for me anyway. And that, in my book, is scuba, a self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. So the only fair way and the true way of doing it is by flooding. It's what your sea mammals do. There are ways, this needs to be taught by an expert who knows what he's doing. Don't try and experiment with it, guys.
Now we're going to hear about the origins of the Frenzel technique, Aharon's opinion on mouthfill and FRC, and we'll start to dive into the principles of Aharon's RV training system.
Anyway, during a period of time of researching science, researching history, legend, everything, I learned a lot from old techniques and I learned a lot from new scientific papers. And I studied the best forms of equalization that were not flooding. Dr. Frenzel, the German doctor who was the doctor of the Luftwaffe, invented the Frenzel maneuver for his Stuka pilots who went down in a straight dive and had to equalize their ears very quickly. Two Italians shortly after that, Marconi and somebody else, managed to, Ogli or Marconi, I can't remember, managed to invent it too because they read the papers in German. Later on, you've got a document which is one of the most complicated documents I've ever read by Eric Fatah, explaining how to do it. But he had very good intentions, very good will, and some people actually finished the document and wanted to learn to do it. So it became a challenge to learn what were the key pins here till we could simplify it and teach it. Because some people do it naturally, but the vast majority don't, and anybody who has done scuba doesn't. Scuba is the worst training that you could possibly do for freediving. So we have Frenzel, but Frenzel was not the way I chose. I have different techniques for involving mouthfeel that do not involve the use of the tongue, which are much gentler, much quicker, and much more efficient, that I do in connection with a mouthfeel, which is not mouthfeel where you're filling under the jaw with gigantic quantities of air. It's not necessary. And after the air gives out, you have to switch to a particular type of Frenzel that I teach, with a particular technique of empty lung teaching. And people like Aolin Wang, the Chinese guy who just did 106 meters in Roatan, who now has made a statement saying that he has no problems with any equalization at any depth whatsoever. It's kind of a system of teaching a new type of equalization for very, very deep divers.
Is this, I've read him referring to an RV training system that you taught him. Is that what you're referring to? Yeah.
Again, don't do it, guys, unless you've got somebody who is expert in teaching you.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about the mouthfeel, because there are many people, and perhaps yourself included, who think that the mouthfeel in whatever form is taught too early. For example, someone who starts out with a failure depth, let's say, of 25 meters.
Yeah, in that case, his Frenzel is useless.
Right. So do you think it's possible to train in such a way that the failure depth increases to, 50, 60 meters?
Yes, absolutely. And that's I wouldn't really start teaching somebody until he'd hit 50 or 60 meters with a Frenzel, because he simply doesn't understand it enough. And he simply hasn't got the internal gymnastics to be able to master the rest of it. I also find teaching with BTV, Béance tubulaire volontaire, hands-free equalization. Yeah? Because it's a voluntary opening of the eustachian tubes by manipulating the muscles that open the eustachian tubes. This is critically important for very, very deep divers. And one of the secrets in this is, of course, jaw position and learning how to do it. And it's not that many people who are very successful in teaching hands-free equalization. Okay, let me put this in a bit of more of an orderly fashion. In my technique, on empty lungs, I have no use for FRC, by the way. It's incredibly dangerous. I'm talking empty lungs, RV, residual volume. Okay, the first stage of RV training is all about managing your cheek fill. I do not use mouth fill. You're managing your cheek fill. And when you can manage your cheek fill successfully down to 120 meters, down to 20 meters, which is the equivalent of more than 120 meters on full lungs, depending on how much you estimate your RV being, between 25 and 20%. Then we move on from there and do the second part of training, where you go down totally empty lungs with no air in the mouth. But you have to learn the technique. And once you've got that, you have done several things that are really important. One, you've done you've learned all the equalization techniques for more or less any feasible depth. The second thing that you've learned is your body has learned how to manage pressure. And you got accustomed to pressure. And that means that you don't have any more trigger points. Now, a trigger point is an interesting phenomenon that we discovered the first time on Paxos many, many years ago, where we had an aspiring diver who was going down to 93 meters and stopping exactly at 93 meters, give or take 40 centimeters every time. You could take the alarms off him, the watch off him, you could take the marks on the rope, and he would always stop at the same depth. What's going on here? What was going on was that his subconscious mind, which is something that I could talk for hours about on freediving because it's one of the key elements of deep freediving, subconscious mind is aware of a new sensation and saying, hey, wait a minute, guys, this is a new sensation. I'm not comfortable with this. And then he tenses up, and then there's no more equalization, and that's where the dive stops. It's a little bit like if you were a beginner learning Tai Chi push hands, that you have somebody standing opposite you and pushing a hand very slowly, palm facing you towards your chest. As that begins to invade your personal space, as it gets closer and closer to your body, the natural reaction is to tense up, to resist the blow. Now, in freediving, there isn't a blow. There's a gradual increase of pressure. But at a certain point, the subconscious says, hey, wait a minute, I don't like this. This is completely new. And you tense up, and that's the end of equalization. That's what we call a trigger point. And it does away with trigger points, my system of training. It brings on the blood shift much stronger and much earlier. Unlike most of the things where people are going down and they're terribly cautious of, oh, I should be doing big pulls at the bottom if I'm doing free immersion. Hey guys, if your blood shift is complete, you're not in danger. If it isn't complete, you're in danger with nearly any movement you make. Now, what I mean by complete is this. We know that in blood shift, the capillaries, the alveoli deflate, the little air sacs in the lungs deflate. Now, the capillaries, which are the blood vessels, the whole network of them that are on the surface of the alveoli, dilate to more than 200% with blood that has shifted in from the arms and the legs. Now, what happens if the alveoli collapse, before the blood vessels have dilated to 200%? You get some sort of space created, don't you?
Right, yeah, so this is going to lead to some kind of lung injury or squeeze.
Yeah, it is. It's going to end up as lung squeeze. Now, other things that, with the old technique of the exaggerated mouth fill, and then when do I refill and all the rest of it, because at a certain depth that's going to go. And it's going to go much faster because you're using your tongue. And I don't care. Very few people are that perfect with their tongue that when they use the tongue, a certain amount of air doesn't go back into the lungs, which is called swallowing your air. And then the recovery of air with a aggressive movement at depth leads to lung squeeze. So all these things, there's been so much training that is wrong. And it's based on wrong physiology, and it's frankly extremely dangerous. But you can see still on YouTube, there's a thing of Herbert Nietzsche doing a free immersion dive of over 120 meters, I believe, and he's pulling like hell at the bottom. Why is he pulling like hell at the bottom? He wants to get up quickly. He's not worried about lung squeeze because he's done his homework on RV training. And today there is total confusion caused by amateur guessers who said, oh, RV training is far more severe than FRC training. No, it isn't. You stand a much bigger chance of a lung injury by going down too quickly before you've got complete blood shift. On FRC, RV, that can't happen. You will be stopped by your inability to equalize long before you're in any danger of hurting your lungs. And there's so much misinformation on the net and on even the training institutions that, one is fighting that the whole time. Look, if you start RV training, a beginner on it, never push them, never have them with weights on their body. Those are two elementary safety precautions right at the beginning. Because you never want to try RV training, particularly at the beginning, with weights on the body, okay? So you're pulling down the thing. You've got much less buoyancy than you would normally have. You don't really need the weights, and the weights would make you go far too fast, and you might outrun your equalization. You're pulling down with a nose clip, without a mask, yeah, and you're doing your RV equalization with the technique that Aharon has just taught you, the cheek fill. Not the mouth fill. Nothing to do with the tongue. And you find it's quick, it's easy, and it's comfortable. But hey, I get to 5 meters. I don't know what happened. Where did the air go? Did I swallow it? Did I have air in my mouth that I couldn't use? These are all questions I have to ask myself. And hey, what happened here? I couldn't go down any deeper. Bit by bit, slowly, meter by meter, we progress. Around about 15 meters, all sorts of revelations begin to come in. When we get to 20 meters, yeah, then we know we're ready. When we get to 30 meters, like people like Aulin and Matt Molina are doing, Matt Molina is doing it in a cold quarry in Poland that is 2 degrees temperature, because Matt is made of iron, yeah. But he worked this technique, and ask him about it. When you get to these things, you have different battles. As Aulin says at the moment, he says to me, look, I've got a battle with narcosis, nitrogen narcosis, yeah? Now, we've got Mr. William Trubridge, who said there's no such thing as nitrogen narcosis, it's all CO2. Actually, wrong, guy. Very wrong. It is nitrogen narcosis that is augmented by CO2. And CO2 is the big player in the game. So what you have to do at this stage is, in order to cut down the fact that you don't come up from a 105 meter dive laughing like a schoolgirl, because you're knocked out of your head, the best way is to cut down on the CO2 first, because that's what's augmenting it all the time. Now that means cutting down on the effort, doesn't it? It means cutting down exposure at depth. So it means, in short, hydrodynamicism, correct tactics. That means when you're going into a deep dive, do you do a 2-part dive, a 3-part dive of descent? And when you come up, yeah, you're going to be coming up fast to avoid maximum exposure to it. But here's the question. You want to come up fast with the minimum effort. That means everything on style and technique of your monofinning. And there's also technique, which very few people realize, in free immersion. Most people, when they're doing free immersion, pulling down like monkeys on a pole. I mean, there is real technique in this, of how you move your hands, you move your shoulders, you twist your body, everything. I mean, all these things to save CO2 and to save narcosis at depth.
I want to just ask you one question about the RV training and the difference that you mentioned between the cheek fill and the mouth fill.
Right.
I imagine that's probably not something that's so easy to teach over an audio interview or even YouTube videos, but could you kind of just clarify exactly what the difference is?
In one, you don't use your tongue at all. Every time that you use your tongue, you're risking swallowing small quantities of air. It means that your air, the air in the cheeks, your cheeks are going to be deflated at a depth that might be even pathetic, like 55 meters or something. So why do it? The other thing is, there's a whole thing about tactics, which I would have to talk about, because what depth do you fill your cheeks at? Oh, before we used to say, oh, we'll try to fill them at 30 meters. And then people found out that didn't work too well. Yeah. The deeper you fill them, the deeper you can go, right? No, wrong. So people are now filling somewhere about 18 to 20 meters. Is that a good idea? No. My people fill on the surface. Now, do you need to top up? No. If you train correctly, you don't need to top up. If you're still doing Frenzel and with full cheeks, yes, you do. And they're going to collapse probably around about 55 meters. And then what are you going to do? You have to rely on the second technique, which might take you a way, depending on how good it is. And most of them don't know it. How to do the equalization techniques when you've got no air in your mouth. Now, all the things, the steps, all the techniques, except Valsalva, are interconnected. And they're a holistic thing.
We're going to round up part 1 with a little bit about BTV and its importance and potential in deep diving, and then a warning from Aharon about the importance of doing your research and building a solid basis of real knowledge before jumping in the deep end.
BTV, yeah. If you really want an easy time at depth, this is something worth investing in learning.
Right. So would you say that BTV could be perhaps the most underrated or underutilized practice in freediving training?
I think it's the most misunderstood.
It seems that most people kind of have this, people who are able to do it naturally are often looked upon with this kind of jealousy, like, I could never do that. I hear it's incredibly difficult to learn. It's very hard to find people who have actually taught themselves to do it effectively. Do you think that's just a misconception, that it's that difficult?
I think it is harder to teach than anything else, and I think there are fewer people capable of teaching it. Yeah, because you have to get in touch with muscles that normally you don't utilize, and you have to be able to mentally get in touch with them. Now, there are exercises and there are short pathways to being able to put you on the right path. Will everybody be able to do it? No. Will a lot higher percentage of people than people imagine be able to do it? Definitely. Yeah. One of the main reasons is how it's taught. The Italians were experts at teaching it. Umberto and his prodigies like Davide Carrera and William Trubridge to a certain extent, yeah, who learned from Umberto. And here we go back to Ogdalia and Mercante, because they said, screw Frenzel, we want to do it without, we'll have both hands on the wheel, so to speak. So if you read the original documents and everything else, you might have a revelation. Then there are some shortcuts.
Which documents are you referring to?
The documents of the Italian Air Force teaching BTV to its everything. All main thing is, before you become a competitive freediver, for God's sake, get some knowledge, inform yourself. Don't just read YouTube or Facebook or some other garbage. Yeah, actually try and to do some research and inform yourself. And it's amazing what you can come up with. Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. Real knowledge, not like, oh, so-and-so says this. And then a new champion turns up next year. Oh, no, he says this. And state of total confusion. You don't know what the hell you're doing. And we had a period where people coming up and spitting blood after every dive. I hope this is different now, with a slightly better understanding of the thing, but we're still a long way from really understanding what we should be understanding by making deep diving safer.
So there you have it. Do your research, get some knowledge. That's what the Freedive Café is for. Here we are doing our best to turn the tide in favor of real knowledge and wisdom, and with the help of the world's finest freediving athletes and breath holders of all shapes and sizes, we will make our passion safer and better understood. Let's do that together, guys. Aharon has a lot more to share. Keep an eye out for the second part of this 2-part special, which I hope to release on New Year's Eve in a few days. Don't forget to subscribe to the show so you never miss an episode. Regardless of your religious or cultural beliefs, I wish to thank everyone for listening, and I hope you all have a wonderful Christmas and holiday season with your family and friends. And whatever you do, dive safe.